The United States budget deficit. How are you guys doing today? My name is Apple, and today we are filling in the financial gap between schools and the real world by helping you guys build some financial literacy skills as a college student. All right, so what we're talking about today is the United States budget deficit. So basically what we're going to talk about is what even is a deficit? What is a deficit in the first place? Because I'm sure you've heard the term the budget deficit. I'm sure you've heard it tossed around all the time in the news, on NPR, all these places. Budget deficit, it is a term that you got to know what it means because it will be coming up in all kinds of places. So what even is it? Why do we have one in the first place? Why does the United States operate at a deficit? Why do we have a deficit? And what are the implications of this deficit going forward? What does having a deficit mean for our future as a country? And what direction are we trending? And what implication does that have as well? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe, share this video with a friend so that they can learn about the budget deficit, because it is something that you do got to know. As a United States citizen, you got to know about the budget deficit because it is such an important factor in our economy and in our nation as a whole. So let's just hop right in, and we're going to start off with some government spending background. So as you probably know, we as a country are in debt. We are in some pretty serious debt. To be more specific, we have about 20.6 trillion with a T, $20.6 trillion in debt. That is what our country is at right now as the United States. If you want to see a specific number, you can actually go to the debt clock. It's like usdebtclock.com or something. Just Google it. But it is a super cool website. It shows you how fast that number is increasing, and there's just all these different information on there. Really, really cool. Would recommend check out that website. But 20.6 trillion is about our national debt right now. So that's pretty ridiculous, the fact that we are in that much debt. So we got to know about this deficit thing. So when the government wants to spend money, they usually spend more than they actually take in every year. So to do that, they have to issue things called bills, they have to issue things called notes, and they have to issue things called bonds. And these allow the government to basically operate with more money, to borrow money, all this good stuff from other people, from other countries, in order to operate in the way that they want to and spend money that they want to, even when they don't particularly have that money. So they got to raise some funds, they got to go into debt to all these different kinds of people, all different people, countries, taxpayers, all this good stuff. They're going into debt to finance things that they want to pay for. So when they go into debt, when they issue all of these things, all of these bonds, that causes interest rates to go up. So when the government issues bonds, when they issue bonds, and bonds are just a way for the government to raise money, they are basically an IOU. So the taxpayer buys a bond from the government. They buy an IOU, and the government is going to be paying them regular interest payments over time to pay off that bond. All right, however, with these bonds, they do have to incentivize. The government has to incentivize people to buy them. And in order to incentivize people to buy these bonds, they have to offer higher and higher interest rates on the bonds, because if they have low interest rates, no one's going to want to invest in these bonds, so they have to offer higher interest rates. Now, when the government raises interest rates, there are three pretty significant things that are going to happen. These are not the only three things, but these are three pretty significant things that are going to happen when the government raises interest rates by selling more bonds and going further into debt. So the first thing that's going to happen is company interest rates are going to have to go up. So companies also issue bonds in order to raise money, in order to go into debt to finance some of the things that they want to do as a company. Now, when the government is raising their interest rates, the companies are going to have to do the same to keep up, because if the government is offering high interest rates, companies are offering low interest rates, no one's going to buy the company's bonds, and the company's not going to be able to raise the money that they need. So the company is going to have to raise their interest rates in order to incentivize people to invest in their bonds and not just invest in government bonds. So interest rates are going up, not only with the government, but also with individual corporations. All right. So does that make sense? We got government rates going up, so companies have to keep up by raising their rates. Next thing that's going to happen is homes are going to become less affordable. So mortgages are based on the Treasury bond. The 10-year Treasury bond is the basis for a lot of mortgages. So the 10-year Treasury bond, that is a bond that the government puts out, Treasury bond. So when the Treasury bond goes up, when the interest rate on the treasury bond goes up, it becomes harder for people to buy a home, because that means the interest rate on their mortgage is going to go up. So less people are going to be able to buy homes when interest rates go up, when bond interest rates go up, and when the government is raising more money. So homes become less affordable. Less affordable homes is another effect that occurs when the government is actually raising more money and raising their interest rates, all right? So we got less affordable homes, we got corporations raising their interest on their bonds, which is great for consumers because then we're gonna be able to invest and get a better return on our investment. But then our last thing that's gonna happen when the government raises their interest rates on their bonds is that stock prices are actually going to drop. So stock prices will drop when the government raises their interest rates for the most part. Now, why is this? Why are stock prices going to drop when the government needs to raise more money, when they're raising interest rates on their bonds? Well, this is because bonds are seen as a more safe investment than stocks. So when it comes down to it, when people are deciding what to invest in, a lot of times they're sitting down and they're deciding directly between stocks and bonds. Now, this is not the case for a lot of people. There are so many other asset vehicles you could invest in, gold, real estate, maybe cryptos, all these different things that you can invest in. But a lot of people see it as sort of a dichotomy between stocks and bonds. And what they see is when bond rates are going up, and then bonds become more valuable and they decide to invest more in bonds and less in stocks. So when bond rates go up, people get out of stocks and get into bonds because they see this as a less risky investment, and when they're paying more out, then they want to invest more of their portfolio in bonds because it's going to be getting them a better return. So those are the three main things that are going to happen when governments need to raise money, when they need to raise interest rates. They're going to corporations are going to raise their interest rates, homes are going to be less affordable, and your stock prices are going to drop. So that's what you got to look for when the government raises money and raises interest rates. So far looking at this, we got two not so good things, we got two not so good things, and one kind of good thing. But there is more good stuff to the government going into debt than just our interest rates going up. And that comes in the form of investment. So a lot of times, the government is going to need to borrow money to invest in our economy, to invest in businesses, to invest in just spurring growth in the economy. That is good debt. So when the government is going into debt to finance big projects and to spur growth in the economy, that is going to be what I would consider good debt, or at least better debt than them going into debt simply to pay mandatory spending. So mandatory spending are these things, they're like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all that good stuff, all stuff that is really, really good. But when the government goes into debt when the government needs to go into debt to pay off these things, then they're not actually spurring any economic growth. They're just making these payments that they're already obligated to do. And if they have to go into debt to do that, then that's going to be really tricky because they're not spurring growth to encourage more growth in the economy, to generate more income to be able to pay off their debt. If they're just using these for mandatory payments, then it's going to be a lot trickier for them to actually be able to pay off this debt someday. So you really want to see government debt going to fund big projects, big things that are going to invest in our economy as a whole, as opposed to just mandatory payments, which the government needs to be paying out anyway, and they should not have to go into debt to do that. That's not a great sign. All right, so that's our government background. That's our history lesson for the day on the national debt and what that's all about, and sort of some implications with the national debt in general. So now let's talk about a deficit. What actually is a deficit, you might ask? And a deficit is simply the rate of change of the national debt. So the deficit is the rate of change of the national debt, all right? Rate of change of the national debt is what a deficit is. So basically, when spending is greater than your taxes or your revenue, all right? When spending is greater than taxes, when the government is spending more than it's bringing in, then they're operating at a deficit. So they're spending $1 million, but they're only taking in $800,000. In that case, they're operating at a $200,000 deficit, all right? So they're spending $200,000 more than they actually take in. So therefore, they're going to have to get that $200,000 from somewhere else. They're not bringing it in taxes, so they have to raise it through what we would call debt financing, going into debt and issuing bonds to the public in order to raise that money. And like we talked about, that's going to raise interest rates and have all those tangential effects that we talked about at the beginning of the video. So that's what a deficit is. And the opposite of a deficit is a surplus. So say the government took in $1 million in taxes and they only spent $800,000. Then they're operating at a $200,000 surplus, and they have an extra $200,000 left at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, whatever. And they're going to have that extra money left to invest, to save, to put aside, all that good stuff. That really never happens with the government. We're never at a surplus. Sometimes we might get to a balanced budget, but that happens very rarely as well. We are pretty much always operating at a deficit in the United States as a government. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. We are pretty much always spending more than we're taking in taxes. That is how the government works right now. Now, when you do this as an individual, if you were going to go out and you're going to spend more money, if you're operating at a deficit at an individual level, that is when your credit score is going to tank and collections are going to come knocking at your door. So you can't really operate under a deficit as an individual because you have these obligations to pay off your debt pretty immediately, whereas with the government, they are given much longer time to do so. And the lenders to our government, such as the taxpayers, such as like China and other countries, are a lot more lenient than your credit card company would be if you tell them, oh, I'm just operating at a deficit right now. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. You can't really operate at a deficit at an individual level, at least not without some serious legal repercussions there. So when the government does it, they get reelected. When politicians say that they are going to operate at a deficit, they get reelected. And that is because nobody wants to hear that the government is going to cut spending and raise taxes, because that's what getting out of a deficit means. It means you have to increase your taxes. You have to increase the money that you're taking in every single month, and you have to decrease the money that you're spending. And when politicians come up and they say, all right, I'm going to raise taxes about 50% and we're going to cut spending in half, nobody is going to want to elect that person, at least not the majority of people, because they're not going to see that as beneficial. They're not going to say, well, we want more stuff, we don't want less stuff, and we want to pay you less for that more stuff. We don't want to have to pay you more. So that is one of the reasons why the deficit is kind of persistent, because people don't elect somebody who says they're going to make you pay more and give you less. So that is one of the contributors to the deficit. So historically, our deficit has been about 3% of GDP. So 3% of GDP, and GDP is gross domestic product, and that just means how much stuff we make in the US. So historically, we have operated about 3% deficit to GDP ratio. And right now, that ratio is actually at about 5%. So we are operating at a pretty significant deficit right now, actually. And I'll get to exactly how much that is in a little bit, but it's very significant. So right now, we're at about 5%. So that's not too ideal. Means that we're operating at a little bit higher of a deficit than normal. So that's definitely something to be aware of. Now, our debt to GDP ratio measures the stability of an economy. So your entire national debt, as compared to how much money you're generating every single year, that really measures how stable a country is. Now, according to the World Bank says that the tipping point and the point where your economy becomes a lot less stable is at 77%. So if your country has 77%, if their entire national debt is 77% of their GDP, if your debt is 77% of your GDP, so say your GDP is $100 million and your national debt is $77 million. That would be the tipping point. So the World Bank says if you go beyond that, then you are on the road to some pretty serious trouble. So you definitely don't want to pass that 77% mark at all. That is a very dangerous spot. But luckily in the US, our debt to GDP ratio is only 105.4%. Oh wait, that's more than 77%. So this is pretty significant, guys. We have been operating above that 77% mark for about 5 years now. We have been operating above that 77% mark since about 2010. So this is not a great sign for our economy. The fact that we have more debt than we're actually bringing in every year is not a great sign, especially when this number's over 100%. That is bad news bears. So we don't want to be seeing this number. This is pretty worrisome, in my opinion, the fact that our debt to GDP ratio is in fact over 100% and just over 77% in general, which is where the World Bank says the tipping point actually is for that ratio. All right, so that is what we got to keep in mind. And basically what we got is our deficit is just if your spending is greater than your taxes, then you've got a deficit. You're spending more than you're taking in revenue. So that is what a deficit is. And the reason that our debt to GDP ratio is pretty high right now is because after the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, we had to do some serious economic spending. We had to really boost the economy. We had to put in a bunch of investment. There was just a bunch of economic spending that was contributing to our debt. We had to really push a bunch of money in to really kickstart our economy, kick it into gear again. So that is what drove our debt to GDP ratio over that 77% mark and eventually over that 100% mark. All right, so now why do we have a deficit? Why is this something that we operate with in the United States? Well, I will tell you, but first I'm going to tell you how much it actually is. So our current deficit right now is actually $985 billion with a B dollars. So $985,000 million. That's just a ridiculous amount to me. Can't even comprehend how much money that is. But $985 billion, and the primary number one reason that we have this deficit is due to, you guessed it, military spending. So not trying to get into politics here, just trying to tell you guys about why we operate at a deficit, and military spending is definitely the number one reason for that. We have by far the largest military of any country in the world, and that is not cheap to maintain. So our military spending is what is driving this deficit higher and higher pretty much every single year. So military spending is definitely the number one thing that we are spending on that contributes to our deficit. Second thing is mandatory spending. So mandatory is our second most contributing factor to our deficit. And mandatory spending, like I talked about before, is just things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, these programs that the government pays for regularly and that they need to have money for on a regular basis to maintain. That is another one of the big expenses that is contributing to our deficit. So that is something to keep in mind there. And like I talked about before, with the economic spending plan that got us out of the recession, that really required a lot of economic spending, which is what drove our national debt through the roof. So with that plan that boosted us out of the recession, there were definitely some downsides, and one of them was our national debt skyrocketed because our deficit grew massively, basically. So that was a pretty significant thing that happened in 2008, 2009, get us out of that financial crisis. So what that really did is it lowered taxes. So taxes went down, and like you'll remember, when taxes are less than spending, then we are at a deficit. So taxes go down, that means our deficit goes up. Next thing that happened was our unemployment went up. So unemployment went up, and that is going to generate less revenue because less people are making money, and the economy is just slowing down when less people are employed. And lastly, our public spending went up, and we'll look back to our deficit equation. When spending goes up and taxes go down, that means the deficit gets even bigger on both sides of the candle. You are extending it both ways, and you are making this doubly, the effect is felt doubly as much. So that is some of the reasons that we have a deficit right now. That economic spending plan really did boost the additions to our deficit and our debt. So that is something to keep in mind. And next, what we're going to talk about is three large factors that just contribute to deficits in general. So when it comes to deficits, there are three big things that can contribute to deficits. The first one is slow growth. So when the economy is growing slowly, it's going to be a lot trickier for the government to raise more money and spend less money because they have to spend more money to basically, they're trying to spur more growth in the economy. That is the whole point. They have to drive the economy. They're trying to maintain a certain level of growth consistently. So in order to spur that growth, they got to spend more and potentially cut taxes in order to incentivize people to spend more. So slow growth is going to contribute to a deficit pretty significantly. The next thing is high government spending. So high spending, like we talked about in our equation, is going to contribute to a deficit, because if you have higher spending and your taxes don't go up with that, then you are going to encounter a greater deficit because you're spending more than you're taking in, and that is what a deficit is. And our third one is a trade deficit. So with a trade deficit, you're just spending more on trade than you're taking in, and that is going to cause our internal GDP to not do so hot. And because we're spending more on other stuff and we have a trade deficit going. So don't want to have a trade deficit because that is going. So trade deficit is also going to add to our national deficit, our national budget deficit. And another thing that just escalates a deficit is any conflict. So any wars, anything like that, any international conflicts are going to escalate a deficit because they are going to increase defense spending, which is the biggest thing that contributes to deficit is military and defense spending. They're going to increase borrowing. The government is going to have to issue more bonds and borrow more money from the taxpayers in order to finance all of this spending, which is again going to drive our deficit up. And lastly, with a big conflict, that's going to slow the economic growth in our country because we have to devote more of our time and energy to defense things, military stuff. So that's going to slow our economic growth if there are conflicts, either domestically or abroad, that we are involved in. So that is another reason that our deficit could grow, is due to conflict. So now let's talk about the implications of the deficit on the taxpayers, on you and me. So why should we care? What does this have to do with us? Why should we care if the government is spending nearly $1 trillion more each year than it actually has? So basically what it comes down to is, again, our big three effects of our deficit are going to be our interest rates on corporate bonds and other kinds of bonds going up. So that is a good thing for us, for our investing needs. We're able to invest in bonds with higher interest rates, so that's great. However, housing becomes less affordable because, as you'll remember, the 30-year mortgage, a standard mortgage, is based on that interest rate of the 10-year Treasury bond, which is a government bond. So when bond rates go up, mortgage rates go up as well. And lastly, we've got stock prices going down because, again, people switch from stocks to bonds, driving the price of bonds up and the price of stocks down. So those are our three big implications on us, on the people, when our government drives a bigger deficit. These are the three big things that we will usually see going along with a deficit. So why does this always happen? Why are we pretty much always operating at a deficit in the United States? Well, what it really comes down to, what our deficit really comes down to, is that the government spends to fuel the economy. So the government is going to spend money when they see economic growth slowing in order to foster greater growth, in order to foster more investment. They are going to increase spending and cut taxes in order to foster growth for the most part. And that is going to, like we said, increase our deficit from both ends. Increasing spending is going to make us have more money that we're putting out, and decreasing taxes is less money that we're taking in. So that is going to increase our deficit from both ends of the candle. So, however, when we operate at a deficit to boost the economy, to boost economic growth, what can actually happen is, if we take this too far, it can actually cause the economy to overheat. So it can cause us to get going too fast, and so fast that we in fact overheat, and the economy is just growing too quickly, it's unsustainable, and then we hit a recession. So that is why a recession happens. It's if we're just driving growth too fast, if we're spending too much money, pumping too much into the economy, it just gets going too fast, and then it hits a recession. So that is definitely something that can happen. If our deficit gets too out of control, it can lead us straight into a recession. So we got to watch out for that. Another reason this always happens is because countries are willing to lend us money. Countries like China are willing to say, all right, here is a couple $100 billion, I don't know. And they're willing to just give us this money because they know that they're going to be getting interest on it, and they are totally fine just giving us money because they have it right now, and they're fine lending it to us for us to go out and build our military and all that good stuff. They're fine doing that, and they know they're going to be getting paid interest on that, and they know that the U.S. is very unlikely to default on those loans, but they do know that it's probably going to take them a while to be getting paid back. Next reason this always happens is that we elect people that spend money. Like I said before, we don't elect people who say, all right, we're going to cut all of the public spending that we're doing in this town. We're going to take away all the highway spending. We're going to leave all the potholes. We're going to not build any sidewalks, not improve any schools, none of that stuff. We're not going to do any of that. And we're going to make you pay 50% more in taxes. How does that sound? Vote for me. So no, that's not how you're going to get elected. That is one of the ways that you could reduce the deficit, but that's not how you're going to get elected, because no one's going to vote for you. No one's going to say, okay, we don't want any more good stuff for this town, this city. We're fine the way it is, and just let it get worse. And we'll pay you more money too, because we want that. That's not how it's going to work, and no one's going to vote for somebody who says that. So people who increase the deficit by spending more and taking less in taxes are the people that get elected. So that is definitely something to keep in mind when you're thinking about the deficit as a whole. So that's the budget deficit for you guys. And it's just really important to think about the debt, the national debt, the budget deficit, because they're very significant macroeconomic trends that occur in our economy, and that they really say a lot about the economy's health. So it's really important to have at least some kind of idea. I mean, obviously, you don't have to know the exact numbers on these things. You don't have to know that the national debt is like $20.6 trillion right now, or that our deficit is at about 985 million, or 985 billion rather. You don't have to know these numbers, and you don't have to know all the exact things, but it's good to have a rough idea of what's actually going on with our country, what's going on in the world, so you can operate from a more educated standpoint and just really have a more worldly view and have a good perspective on what's actually happening right now. So that's what I wanted to share with the budget deficit is, guys, because a lot of people hear this stuff in the news. They hear about the deficit going up, deficit going down, all this good stuff, and they really just don't have a totally good idea about what actually that means and the implications that might have on the individual and on the country as a whole. So that's what this video is all about. Just sharing with you guys what a deficit is, why we have one, and what are the implications of a deficit. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, share this video with a friend. I'll see you tomorrow, and until next time.